Imagine a land where silence is survival, where a wrong word or no word at all could send you thousands of miles away into an icy wasteland. No trial, no explanation, no return. In the heart of the Soviet Union, behind the grand speeches and parades, existed a hidden empire of forced labor camps, the Gulag. This was not a relic of war or a short-lived policy. It was an organized, state-run network of repression that imprisoned millions of innocent people under the guise of justice. But how did it begin? And why did a country that spoke of equality and progress build one of the most oppressive systems in modern history? In today's story, we journey back to the early days of the Soviet Union, where idealism collided with paranoia, and power was maintained through fear. The Soviet Gulag, short for Glavno Upravlenie Lagerai, or Main Camp Administration, was not merely a set of prisons. It was a vast mechanism of control. Established under Lenin in the early 1920s and expanded on an unimaginable scale by Joseph Stalin, it became the hidden engine behind the Soviet dream, powered by forced labor and political terror. At its peak, the Gulag system included thousands of camps scattered across the most remote and hostile parts of the USSR-dense forests, Arctic tundras, desolate mountains. Millions of people passed through its gates, many of them never to return. Their only crime, sometimes it was a private joke, a misplaced book, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Other times, they were targeted for being too educated, too religious, or simply inconvenient to those in power. What happened behind those barbed wire fences remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. Yet many still do not know the full truth. In this video, we uncover how the Gulag worked, what life inside was truly like, and how it shaped the fate of a nation. If you are passionate about uncovering forgotten history, understanding the resilience of the human spirit, and learning from the past to build a better future, then you are in the right place. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our deep dive documentaries. Now, let us step into the shadowed corridors of Soviet power and meet the men, women, and children who were swallowed by the Gulag but never forgotten. It began quietly. No explosions, no battlefield, no warnings. Just a knock at the door in the middle of the night. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union was a nation in transformation, shaped by revolution and driven by the vision of creating a classless utopia. But beneath the surface of progress lay a growing fear, one that would soon erupt into a storm of silence, betrayal, and loss. What followed was not a war in the traditional sense. It was a purge, a state-driven campaign that would target its own people. A campaign in which no one, not even the most loyal citizen, was truly safe. In 1936, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union launched what came to be known as the Great Purge. It was a period of mass repression that reached into every corner of society: factories, farms, schools, churches, even the military command. It was not merely about rooting out spies or traitors. It was about eliminating potential threats, real, imagined, or fabricated. It was about control. Across cities and villages, people were accused of being enemies of the people, a vague and all-encompassing label that required no real evidence. They were teachers, writers, engineers, priests, scientists, and neighbors. Many had spent their lives supporting the ideals of the revolution. But loyalty was no protection. In fact, the more loyal you were, the more dangerous you could appear. Those with influence, education, or an independent voice often found themselves in the crosshairs of suspicion. It could begin with a rumor, a misinterpreted conversation, a jealous colleague's accusation, or nothing at all. Entire families were torn apart overnight. Fathers taken from their beds, mothers dragged from work, children left waiting for parents who would never return. Interrogations followed, some lasting days, others weeks. Many prisoners were subjected to physical and psychological pressure. sleep deprivation, isolation, and relentless questioning until they signed confessions for crimes they did not commit. The scale was staggering. Within just a few years, millions of people were arrested. Some were executed immediately. Others were sentenced to years of forced labor in the Gulag system, which by now had grown into an extensive network of camps stretching across the most unforgiving landscapes of the Soviet Union. These were places chosen not for safety or sustainability, but for their remoteness. The further away, the better. Out of sight, out of mind. Inside these camps, the reality was brutal. Prisoners worked long hours in freezing temperatures, often with inadequate clothing and barely enough food to survive. Many were assigned to logging, mining, railroad construction, or factory work, all essential to the Soviet economy, but often carried out under inhumane conditions. Sickness spread quickly. Injuries were frequent. The weak were left behind. And yet, the Gulag was not just a physical prison. It was a psychological one. Those sent away were erased from society. Their names were removed from records. Their existence denied. Family members were often too afraid to ask questions or speak their names aloud. Fear became a part of daily life for those outside the camps, too. Fear of association, fear of accusation, fear of saying the wrong thing. Even those tasked with enforcing the system were not immune. Secret police officers, camp guards, party members all knew that one day they, too, might be on the other side of the bars. The purges devoured their own architects. High-ranking officials who had carried out arrests one month might themselves be arrested the next. It was a system that fed on uncertainty and suspicion. But what made the terror so enduring was not just the arrests, or the camps, or the purges. It was the silence. The knowledge that your friends had disappeared, and you could do nothing. That a neighbor's window had been smashed in, and the street was quiet again the next morning. That letter stopped coming, and no one dared to ask why. People learned to speak in whispers, to keep their thoughts to themselves, to trust no one. The bonds of community, of family, of faith, all were slowly eroded. Still, even in the darkest corners of the Gulag, sparks of resistance survived. Secret lessons were taught by former professors. Poems were memorized and passed from one prisoner to another. Some risked everything to write letters, smuggled through cracks in the system. A shared loaf of bread, a whispered prayer, a simple act of kindness. These became forms of rebellion. The Great Purge was not merely a political campaign. It was a transformation of the human landscape. It reshaped how people thought, how they loved, how they remembered. By the time the purges began to ease in the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had been fundamentally changed, not just in its government, but in the souls of its people. And yet, so much of it remained hidden. For decades, official histories omitted or downplayed the scale of repression. Survivors often remained silent, too traumatized or too afraid to speak. It was not until after Stalin's death, and even more so after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the full extent of the terror began to emerge through documents, testimonies, and long-suppressed truths. These stories are not just about the past. They are warnings, reminders of how quickly fear can become policy, and how easy it is for silence to become complicity. They teach us that history is not just a collection of dates and events. It is a mirror, showing us who we were, who we are, and what we must never become again. So if you believe in telling these stories, in giving voice to those who were silenced, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold history to light and honors the memory of those who endured when the world looked away. Now, let us continue our journey into the world of the Gulag and uncover what life was truly like beyond the fences. Far beyond the reach of Moscow's busy streets and far removed from the corridors of party power, the train would finally stop. The doors would slide open to reveal a landscape not made for human life, endless white snowfields, forests of blackened pine, skies heavy with silence. This was Siberia, the destination for countless souls whose only crime was a whisper, a family name, an unlucky signature on a page. From the moment they arrived, the prisoners of the Gulag entered a world unlike anything they had known. It was a world where nature was as merciless as the system that sent them there. There were no warm welcomes or waiting explanations. Instead, they were driven into wooden barracks or makeshift huts, structures that barely stood against the wind. Many had no insulation, and in winter, temperatures could plunge to minus 40 degrees Celsius or lower. The thin clothing they had brought from home, often torn and dirty from weeks of train travel, was all they had. Some received worn uniforms or patches of cloth, rarely sufficient to keep out the cold. Blankets, if they existed, were shared among many. Firewood was precious, and fires were often extinguished early by guards who cared more about discipline than mercy. Food was scarce, strictly rationed, and tied directly to work performance. Those who met their daily labor quotas might be given a piece of dark bread, some watery soup, maybe a spoonful of porridge. But those who fell short, often due to illness, injury, or sheer exhaustion, were given less. It created a brutal cycle: work less, receive less, grow weaker, and fall further behind. Malnutrition was not the exception, it was the norm. Hunger gnawed at every hour, pushing some to barter their last possessions and others to the edge of despair. Inside the camps, overcrowding was severe. Barracks meant for 100 might house 300. People slept side by side on wooden planks, on the floor, or in shifts when space was tight. Air grew thick with sweat, illness, and despair. Sanitation was minimal. Water often had to be fetched from frozen rivers and boiled when fuel was available. Latrines, if they existed, overflowed or froze solid. Disease spread rapidly: dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis. Medical supplies were rare, doctors even rarer. Most prisoners were treated not as patients, but as replaceable tools. If you became too sick to work, you were marked for special handling, which for many meant quiet removal, never to be seen again. The work itself was backbreaking and relentless. From dawn until dark, prisoners labored in the forests, cutting trees with dull axes, dragging logs through snow, building roads and railways in terrain that swallowed men and machinery alike. Others mined coal, copper, or gold, descending into tunnels without proper equipment, breathing dust until their lungs failed. Accidents were frequent: a collapsing roof, a falling tree, frostbite that turned fingers black. There were no compensations, no safety nets. You worked, or you were punished. And punishment could mean beatings, solitary confinement in unheated cells, reduced food, or transfer to even harsher camps. Guards ruled with unchecked authority. Some were brutal, others indifferent. A few showed moments of kindness, but kindness was dangerous, even for them. The system rewarded loyalty to rules, not to conscience. Informants were planted among the prisoners, sowing distrust. A careless word could be reported, leading to additional years on a sentence or sudden disappearance. Prisoners learned to speak carefully, or not at all. They trusted no one. Hope, when it came, had to come from within. And yet, even in these bleakest places, the human spirit flickered on. A former professor might hold secret lectures by candlelight, whispering Shakespeare or Tolstoy to those still hungry for knowledge. A painter might scratch images into wood. A poet might compose verses in his mind and repeat them every night to keep them alive. Women supported each other through whispered prayer or shared crusts of bread. Prisoners created their own underground networks, not to escape, but to remember who they were before the walls closed in. But the cold was relentless. It crept into lungs and bones, into dreams and thoughts. Men and women who had once lived full lives were reduced to shadows of themselves. Speaking little, eyes dull with exhaustion. The Gulag did not need bullets or nooses to destroy its victims. Time, hunger, and cold did the work slowly, efficiently. Still, life in the Gulag was not just about suffering, it was about erasure. The Soviet regime rarely acknowledged the individuals caught in its machinery. These were not prisoners with faces and stories. They were statistics, case numbers, entries, and ledgers. Many families never knew what happened to their loved ones. A letter might arrive months later, stating that someone had died of heart failure or pneumonia. Vague phrases used to cover more brutal realities. Graves were unmarked, names omitted. The state hoped the silence would be complete, but the silence did not last forever. After Stalin's death, some prisoners were released, though broken in body and spirit. Others never returned. Their stories came back slowly, whispered at kitchen tables, smuggled into memoirs, etched in the fading memories of those who survived. Today, those voices are more important than ever, not to spread anger, but to illuminate what happens when a system values ideology over humanity. The Gulag was more than a place of exile. It was a machine of survival and suppression, of labor and loss. And though its barracks have rotted and its fences fallen, its history lives on in the stories we tell, the warnings we carry, and the determination never to let such darkness rise unchecked again. In the eyes of the Soviet leadership, the Gulag was more than just a prison system. It was a machine, a vast grinding mechanism designed not only to punish dissent, but to power the ambitions of a state determined to rise at all costs. As millions of citizens were rounded up and sentenced to years of hard labor, they were not simply removed from society, they were repurposed. From the moment the prison doors closed behind them, these men and women became instruments of progress, tools in an industrial dream that demanded sacrifice far beyond the battlefield. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had embarked on one of the most ambitious transformations in history. Stalin's 5-year plans promised rapid industrialization, vast infrastructure projects, and a new socialist future forged through steel, sweat, and willpower. But behind the official speeches and celebratory posters stood a silent force, the labor of prisoners whose efforts would never be acknowledged, whose suffering would never be praised. The camps of the Gulag, scattered across the frozen landscapes of Siberia, the Arctic, and Central Asia, became industrial outposts. Entire regions that were once wilderness were transformed into centers of production, not through innovation or investment, but through human endurance. In the forests, prisoners felled trees by hand, dragging timber through snowdrifts waist-deep and temperatures so low that skin froze in minutes. Every log they cut fed the fires of Soviet construction, from homes in Moscow to factories in the Urals. Along rivers and valleys, thousands of prisoners were marched to construction sites where massive infrastructure projects awaited. One of the most notorious was the White Sea-Baltic Canal, built between 1931 and 1933. Designed to connect the Arctic to the Baltic Sea, the canal was touted as a triumph of Soviet engineering. In truth, it was a triumph of human suffering. Nearly 200,000 prisoners were forced to dig the 141-mile canal with primitive tools, shovels, picks, even their bare hands. The death toll remains uncertain, but estimates suggest tens of thousands perished in the attempt, their names forgotten, their bodies buried in the very earth they carved. Railways, too, were laid across harsh terrain by these unwilling workers. The Baikal-Amur Main Line, one of the most ambitious railway projects in the Soviet Union, cut through mountains and permafrost. While celebrated in later years as a feat of Soviet strength, it was first attempted using Gulag labor. Prisoners blasted rock, laid track, and built tunnels with inadequate tools and no safety measures. Every kilometer gained came at a human cost. Every spike driven into the earth echoed with pain. In the mines of Kolyma, one of the harshest and most feared Gulag regions, prisoners extracted gold, tin, and other valuable minerals under constant watch. The conditions were inhuman frostbite, cave-ins, toxic dust. Guards often pushed prisoners beyond their physical limits, knowing there was always another trainload of workers arriving. Here, the equation was simple. A broken body could be replaced, but the state's hunger for resources was endless. And yet, all of this was celebrated as progress. Soviet officials boasted of their rapid achievements, The factories built in record time, the vast forests cleared, the mines yielding their riches. Few acknowledged that it had been done on the backs of prisoners who had no choice, no rest, and no future. The success of these projects, used as proof of the state's strength, masked the reality that much of the Soviet industrial miracle was constructed through silent coercion. What made the system even more chilling was its efficiency. The Gulag was not just a prison, it was a business model. Camp administrators were evaluated not on justice, but on productivity. Quotas had to be met, output was measured, and any drop in labor could lead to reprimand or replacement. This turned punishment into profit. Every sentence handed down was not only a political statement, it was a calculation of labor hours. Every arrest fed the engine. Prisoners were assigned to work units not based on skill or experience, but on the needs of the state. A poet could be sent to dig ditches. A teacher might be forced to haul logs. A scientist could find himself mining coal. The previous lives did not matter. What mattered was their ability to survive the next shift. Those who collapsed were left behind. Those who spoke out faced harsher treatment. Resistance was crushed, not through violence alone, but through relentless exhaustion. And yet, despite the cold logic of the system, the Gulag economy was riddled with inefficiencies. Projects were often rushed, poorly planned, or unnecessary. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, though completed, was too shallow for most ships and rarely used. Roads and buildings collapsed due to poor materials and slave labor conditions. The drive for speed and numbers often came at the expense of quality, but for the leadership, appearance mattered more than utility. The illusion of progress was enough to justify the suffering. For the prisoners, there was no illusion. Each day was a battle for survival in a system that saw them not as citizens or criminals, but as expendable resources. They built cities they would never live in, extracted gold they would never hold, and constructed monuments they would never see. Their work powered a nation, but their names were erased from its history books. And yet, the traces remain. Today, hidden in the forests and mountains of Russia, the remnants of the camps still stand: collapsed barracks, rusted rail tracks, abandoned watchtowers. They are silent witnesses to an era when forced labor was masked as heroism, when repression was repackaged as productivity. As we uncover this history, it is important not just to remember the numbers, but to understand the lives behind them. The Soviet Union's industrial rise came at a cost that statistics cannot capture. It was paid in frostbitten hands, bent backs, and broken spirits. And though those prisoners may have labored in silence, their legacy speaks clearly to us now. Progress without humanity is no victory at all. Before the frozen camps of Siberia, before the endless labor in forests and mines, before the long trains that carried the condemned into silence, there was the room. It was always small, always dimly lit, always cold. And it was in this room, behind closed doors, deep within city basements and concrete buildings, that the journey into the Gulag truly began. It was here that identities unraveled, that truth became a dangerous thing, and that the human mind was bent, slowly and deliberately, into submission. The Soviet system of repression was not content with simply removing its perceived enemies. It demanded their guilt. It needed signatures, confessions, and public affirmations that the state was always right. And so interrogation became an art, a grim ritual that blended fear, exhaustion, and calculated cruelty. In these rooms, the interrogators were not just investigators. They were architects of guilt, tasked with producing the evidence their superiors required, whether or not that evidence had ever existed. For the accused, the process began suddenly. A late-night arrest, a drive through empty streets, the arrival at an unmarked building where their names were replaced by numbers. They were not told why they had been detained, only that they were under investigation for anti-state activities. From that moment, time lost all meaning. Days and nights merged into one continuous ordeal, and the outside world began to fade into memory. Interrogations could last for hours, sometimes for days without rest. Prisoners were deprived of sleep, kept standing or sitting in stress positions, blinded by lamps, or forced to endure long periods of silence punctuated by sudden bursts of shouting. The goal was not to discover the truth, it was to break the will. Physical force was used when necessary. Slaps, punches, kicks, applied methodically, not in rage, but with purpose. Injuries were kept below the surface whenever possible, bruises hidden beneath clothing. Pain that left no lasting mark, but eroded strength with every repetition. Worse still was the psychological pressure. Prisoners were told their loved ones had been arrested, or would be. Some were told their families had already confessed. Others were offered release if they would cooperate, if they would name names, sign statements, confirm what the state already believed. The line between fiction and fact was intentionally blurred. One moment, the interrogator might speak gently, like an old friend offering advice. The next, they became cold and threatening, reminding the prisoner that resistance would only bring more suffering. In this confusion, many broke, sleep-starved and terrified, unsure of what was real and what was manipulation. They began to doubt themselves. Had they said something wrong at a party? Was it possible someone had misunderstood? Maybe there had been a mistake. But if confessing would make it stop, was not it worth it? And so they signed. They signed statements admitting to sabotage, to espionage, to plotting against the state. They listed conspirators real, imagined, or chosen at random. Some even came to believe the charges, or at least stopped fighting them. It was easier to surrender than to continue resisting an invisible enemy. Once the confession was signed, the machinery moved forward. There was no appeal, no cross-examination. The trial, if there was one, was a formality. The outcome had been decided the moment the papers were filed. For the interrogators, it was a system of quotas. They were rewarded for results, for the number of confessions, for the speed of resolution. A cooperative prisoner made their job easier. A defiant one brought pressure from superiors. There was little space for conscience. Those who hesitated to use force could be accused of disloyalty themselves. And so the cycle continued. Day after day, room after room, confession after confession. This process did not just extract false admissions. It erased identities. Men and women who had spent years building careers, families, lives, were reduced to traitors, stripped of their history, turned into enemies by ink and fear. The system was not designed to find the guilty. It was designed to prove that no one was truly innocent. Once the confession was obtained, the prisoner was sent on to sentencing. For many, this meant years in the labor camps. For others, it meant transfer to another prison, or even execution. And for all, it meant permanent branding. Their names would carry the weight of betrayal, their families would suffer stigma, and their futures, if they lived, would be defined by a moment that was never truly theirs. Inside the Gulag, these stories were whispered in bunkhouses, shared in fragments among prisoners who had endured similar rooms, similar lies. They recognized the hollow stare of someone newly arrived, someone still caught in the spiral of confusion and shame. They offered quiet reassurance, or simply sat in silence to gather an unspoken understanding among those who had survived the first circle of the system. In the broader Soviet society, few dared to speak of what happened in those interrogation rooms. To question the system was to risk becoming part of it. Families learned not to ask why someone had disappeared, not to keep photos in plain sight, not to speak their names aloud. But in private journals, in hidden memoirs, in the memories passed from parent to child, the truth remained. Today, those rooms no longer echo with forced confessions. But the legacy endures. The archives that emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union revealed the scale of what had been done, not only in numbers but in testimonies, the handwritten pleas, the notes smuggled from cells, the last words of those who knew their voices might be lost forever. These were not the stories of enemies. They were the stories of teachers, poets, nurses, mechanics, people who once believed in their country, in their neighbors, in the promise of progress. People who found themselves alone in a room where truth was not something you defended, but something that was rewritten around you. And in remembering them, we remember more than their suffering. We remember the strength it takes to hold on to truth when the world demands its surrender. Once the gates of the Gulag clanged shut behind a prisoner, survival became a daily contest, not just against the cold or hunger, but against the very structure of life inside the camp. The Lieber camps were not merely places of punishment. They were fully contained worlds, each with its own rules, rhythms, and dangers. The brutality of the interrogations and the cruelty of the sentencing may have left deep psychological scars, but it was the daily existence that slowly ground people down, day after day, until they became mere shadows of who they once were. From the moment the morning horn sounded, often before the first pale light of dawn crept across the sky, life in the camp shifted into motion. Sleep, which had come late and restlessly in overcrowded wooden barracks, was abruptly interrupted. There was no time to ease into the day. Prisoners had to rise quickly, dress in the same filthy, threadbare clothing they had worn yesterday and the day before, and line up for roll call. If someone had died in the night, and many did, quietly, from illness or exhaustion, their corpse would be propped up in the line to avoid the punishment that came with a missing body. Work assignments followed immediately. Whether it was cutting timber in sub-zero temperatures, digging ditches through frozen ground, loading stones for construction, or carrying impossibly heavy loads across broken terrain, the tasks were physically punishing. There were quotas to meet, and falling short could mean reduced rations the next day, or worse. The body became both the only asset and the first enemy, breaking down slowly under the weight of endless labor, meager food, and constant exposure to the elements. But the physical hardships were only one layer of suffering. The internal life of the camp was governed by a hierarchy that blurred the lines between victim and oppressor. Criminals, known as blatne, often held more power than the guards themselves. These career criminals had their own code, their own culture, and was sometimes given privileges by the authorities in exchange for helping control the broader prison population. To survive, one often had to align with them or avoid them entirely, which was nearly impossible. These gangs controlled access to extra food, clothing, and shelter. They extorted from the weaker inmates, stole personal belongings, and enforced their dominance through threats and beatings. For political prisoners, teachers, writers, students, and professionals, the arrival into this brutal ecosystem was a shock. Many had never encountered such violence, and those who refused to submit quickly found themselves isolated, targeted, or worse. Alliances were formed cautiously, and betrayal was always a possibility. Informants, too, were everywhere. Some were planted deliberately by the administration. Others volunteered in exchange for minor privileges, an extra slice of bread, a softer work assignment, a reprieve from punishment. These informants reported on conversations, hidden notes, glances deemed suspicious. The result was a constant atmosphere of mistrust. A careless word could lead to solitary confinement, an extension of a sentence, or punishment for an entire barrack. Prisoners learned to speak carefully, if at all. Many retreated into silence, their thoughts buried deep to avoid betrayal. The guards themselves varied. Some were cold and detached, enforcing rules with mechanical efficiency. Others were cruel, wielding power with pleasure, choosing targets at random to assert control. A few, though rare, showed moments of humanity, perhaps smuggling a letter, turning a blind eye to a forbidden act of kindness, or simply offering a nod of acknowledgement. But no one could rely on mercy. The system did not reward compassion. It rewarded discipline and results. And so even those who wished to help risked becoming prisoners themselves. Punishments were ever present. Falling behind during work meant beatings or extra shifts. Possessing forbidden items could lead to isolation in tiny, unheated cells for days or weeks. Even speaking in one's native language, especially for non-Russian prisoners, could be treated as an act of rebellion. In this world, control was maintained not just through force, but through unpredictability. There were no clear rules, only shifting expectations that kept everyone off balance. And that, in many ways, was the point, to break down the individual, to force conformity not through belief, but through fear. Despite all of this, some prisoners found ways to endure. They created small rituals, sharing stories when the guards were not listening, carving messages into wooden bunk planks, teaching each other languages or mathematics in hushed tones. These acts were not grand revolts, but they were defiant in their quiet persistence. In a place where everything was designed to reduce people to numbers, these small efforts were reminders of personhood, of identity, of resistance. But endurance came at a cost. Years spent inside the camps changed people. Friendships, though rare and risky, were precious. Enemies, once created, could not be avoided. The violence of the environment left lasting marks not just on the body, but on the mind. Many prisoners emerged after release, unable to speak of what they had seen. Some chose silence for the rest of their lives, either out of trauma or continued fear. Others tried to write it down, to give voice to the voiceless. A few succeeded in preserving these memories for future generations. The Gulag was not just a system of labor or imprisonment. It was a psychological experiment in total control, an ecosystem designed to test the limits of human resilience. Every hour was a negotiation between self-preservation and dignity, between silence and the need to connect, between survival and surrender. As we walk through the traces left behind, abandoned guard towers, broken tools, rusted locks, we are reminded that these were not just buildings. They were lived in spaces where millions battled for their lives and identities each day, surrounded not only by cold and labor, but by systems designed to isolate and dominate. And yet many endured, not because they had hope for justice, but because they refused to be forgotten. While the horrors of the camps are often recounted through the stories of men, soldiers, workers, intellectuals, the suffering of women was no less devastating, and in many ways, even more haunting. They came from all walks of life: teachers, nurses, farmers, mothers. Some were arrested because of a careless word spoken in a marketplace, others because they were related to someone who had fallen out of political favor. In the eyes of the state, guilt was often inherited. A wife could be imprisoned simply for being married to someone labeled an enemy of the people. A mother could vanish without trial because of an anonymous letter sent by a neighbor or colleague. There was no true safety, only silence. When these women arrived at the camps, many deep in the Siberian wilderness, they were immediately thrown into a world ruled by cold, hunger, and fear. Pregnant women gave birth in wooden barracks, with no doctors, no privacy, and no certainty that their child would survive. And if the child lived, what future awaited them? These infants, born behind barbed wire, opened their eyes to a world without laughter, without schoolbooks, without warmth. Mothers, often malnourished and forced into grueling labor from dawn to dusk, could offer little more than a whispered lullaby before collapsing into sleep, exhausted and cold. Family separation was not just a consequence of the system, it was part of its design. Children were taken from their mothers as early as infancy, placed in orphanages where they were taught to distrust and forget their roots. In some cases, children were never told who their parents were or why they had disappeared. A daughter might grow up believing her mother was dead, while the mother, locked in a distant labor camp, clung to fading memories of her child's face. This emotional dismemberment was a quiet form of violence, less visible than the beatings and interrogations, but just as destructive. Inside the camps, female prisoners were expected to perform the same exhausting work as the men. They dug ditches, chopped wood, hauled stones. The cold did not discriminate, nor did hunger. But women faced other threats as well, threats that lurked in the shadows of the barracks. Some were exploited by fellow prisoners. Others were abused by guards who wielded their power with no fear of consequences. For many women, survival depended on uneasy alliances, on doing whatever it took to stay alive another day. Dignity became a luxury, hope a dangerous indulgence, and yet, in spite of it all, many of these women found ways to endure. They sewed hidden messages into garments. They sang songs in hushed voices after lights out. They passed knowledge, stories, and memories to one another like secret treasures. In doing so, they resisted the erasure of their identities, the reduction of their lives to labor quotas and identification numbers. Some kept mental notes of the date and time their children were born, promising themselves they would find them again, someday, somehow. Those born inside the Gulag system grew up surrounded by fences and patrol towers. For them, this was the world as it was grim, confined, and unforgiving. Many lacked formal education and had little contact with the outside. They learned early that trust was dangerous, that kindness was rare. Their childhoods were marked by absence, no photographs, no birthdays, no bedtime stories. And yet some remembered the quiet strength of their mothers, the way they stood tall, even after hours of labor, the way they whispered defiance in lullabies. These fragments of love, passed on in silence, carried more weight than the state ever imagined. When the camps finally began to empty decades later, survivors were released into a world that had moved on without them. Mothers and children, long separated, sometimes searched for one another, with only fragments of memory to guide them. Some never reunited. Others discovered that their loved ones had died in silence, their stories buried alongside them. But those who did survive carried within them an indelible testimony not just of cruelty and endurance, but of the quiet, powerful love that persisted even in the darkest of places. Women in the Gulag were not merely victims. They were witnesses. They were protectors. They were bearers of truth. In a time when truth was dangerous, their stories deserved to be heard not as statistics or shadows, but as living echoes of resilience. In the heart of the Siberian wilderness, where frost could snap bone and silence swallowed the cries of the forgotten, survival was never guaranteed. For those condemned to the brutal expanse of the Gulag, each dawn was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to vanish in the snow. The system had been designed to break them physically and erase them from memory, yet somehow, amid the endless labor, sickness, and despair, the human spirit endured. It was not strength alone that kept people alive in these frozen hells. It was something far more intangible: solidarity. In the shadow of guard towers, and beneath the weight of impossible quotas, small acts of compassion became acts of resistance. A piece of stolen bread shared with a starving cellmate, a whispered joke that stirred faint laughter among the weary, a word of encouragement passed under the watchful eye of an informant. These gestures were fragile lifelines, fragile but real, reminding prisoners that they were not alone, that their suffering was witnessed, and that hope, however distant, still flickered. In some corners of the camps, knowledge became another form of survival. Political prisoners, intellectuals, scientists, and teachers, rounded up during the purges, quietly turned their minds into classrooms. Lessons were passed in code, drawn in the dirt, murmured in stolen moments during forced marches or inside barracks after curfew. In a place where all freedoms had been stripped, the act of remembering a poem or reciting a theorem became an assertion of identity. These secret classrooms gave meaning to time that otherwise blurred into endless identical days. Religious faith also became a quiet rebellion. Though the regime sought to erase spirituality, many prisoners clung to it with fierce devotion. Hidden crosses carved into bunk beds, silent prayers mouthed before sleep, and fragments of scripture repeated like mantras offered solace in a world that denied dignity. Some prisoners built makeshift chapels out of scraps or snow, not for escape but for strength. Faith provided not just comfort, it gave them the language to endure suffering without losing the belief that life held meaning beyond pain. There were even those who resisted more directly. Underground networks formed loose and always at risk, sharing stolen information, sabotaging equipment, or simply refusing to break. These acts were often punished with isolation, beatings, or worse. But for many, resistance was not just an act of defiance. It was a way to keep their moral compass intact. By refusing to become what the system wanted them to be, silent, complicit, forgotten, they preserved a sense of humanity that the camps worked relentlessly to erase. But despite these sparks of resilience, the reality remained grim. Mortality rates were staggering, especially during wartime. During World War II, resources in the Soviet Union were stretched thin, and prisoners already malnourished and overworked became even more expendable. Rations dwindled to barely edible scraps, and clothing, often insufficient in the best of times, could not protect against the biting winds. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded barracks. Medical care, when it existed, was rudimentary at best. Those who fell behind in work were often left to die. Some camps saw entire populations decimated in a single winter. Entire transports of prisoners arrived only to be consumed by hunger, typhus, or cold within months. Yet within these same death-ridden zones, stories of improbable survival persisted. A woman survived by teaching others to read, earning protection in return. A former engineer used his skills to repair equipment, gaining slightly better conditions. A priest held clandestine services that kept others from despair. The camps may have been designed to isolate, to grind every person into submission, but human connection found ways to persist. And while most never left, their stories did, smuggled in letters, whispered to visitors, or remembered by the few who walked free. These stories formed a hidden record of courage. The Gulag system sought to erase identity, but the very resilience of its victims became a quiet, collective voice that refused to be silenced. Even in the darkest corners of Soviet repression, some light remained faint, flickering but impossible to extinguish. When Joseph Stalin died in 1953, a heavy silence fell over the Soviet Union, not relief, not yet, but a pause. The man whose shadow had loomed large over millions of lives, whose signature had marked the fate of countless souls in the Gulag, was gone. Yet the machinery he built, the institutions of surveillance and silence, remained intact. It would take years for even a fragment of the truth to emerge from beneath the weight of censorship and fear. 3 years later, in a closed session at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev stood before a room of delegates and delivered what would become one of the most consequential speeches in Soviet history. In what became known as the secret speech, Khrushchev condemned Stalin's cult of personality, exposed the brutal purges, and denounced the injustices of mass repression. It was the first official admission, however cautious, that the horrors of the past could not be buried forever. But even this revelation was carefully curated. Khrushchev spoke of excesses, not systems, of mistakes, not machinery. He acknowledged that innocent people had suffered, but the vastness of the Gulag, the forced labor, the institutionalized torture and starvation, the lives broken in silence, was not fully revealed. Still, the impact rippled across the Soviet Union like a tremor. For the first time in decades, the rigid surface of official truth cracked, and from within came a flicker of hope. Amnesties followed, especially for non-political prisoners. Camp populations began to thin. Some of those who had languished for decades behind barbed wire were finally told they could go home if they still had one to return to. For many, families had vanished, homes had been lost, and identities erased. They left the camps, not as heroes or victims, but as strangers in their own country. For some, reintegration was impossible. The state did not offer public apologies, nor were there comprehensive efforts to provide justice or compensation. Official records remained sealed. The Gulag system itself was not publicly dismantled, in full only softened, restructured, renamed. Former prisoners faced suspicion, discrimination, and isolation They carried the weight of memory in a society not yet ready to listen. Still, among those released, there were voices that refused to stay silent. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had served 8 years in the camps, began to write with piercing clarity about the suffering that had been hidden. His novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, published in 1962 during a brief cultural thaw, offered a rare and shocking window into the brutal routines of camp life. It was a quiet revolution, one that took place on the page rather than the street, but it gave name and shape to suffering that had, until then, been faceless. Yet the thaw did not last. By the late 1960s, the political winds shifted again. The state grew wary of dissent, and the limited freedom of expression began to close. Those who tried to expose the full scale of past atrocities were once again labeled subversive. Archives remained sealed, and victims were forced to rely on oral histories, secret memoirs, and the courage of a few editors and publishers willing to risk everything for the truth. Throughout the following decades, the memory of the Gulag lived on not through monuments or school books, but in whispered stories passed down in kitchens, in underground samizdat literature, in the faces of those who bore the quiet marks of survival. It lived in the gaps of official history, in the silences of public discourse. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 did a fuller reckoning begin, but even then, it was piecemeal and uneven. What Khrushchev began in 1956 was not a confession. It was a controlled release, a managed acknowledgement of a tightly selected version of the past, but it cracked open a sealed door, and through that crack, light poured in. It allowed survivors to reclaim their stories. It gave future generations a chance to ask questions once considered dangerous. The legacy of that moment is complicated. The truth did not flood out all at once. It seeped through slowly, met with resistance, revision, and forgetfulness. Even today, debates continue over how the Gulag should be remembered, and whether the scale of human suffering has ever been fully understood. Yet for those who endured it, the men, women, and children torn from their lives, the forced laborers in permafrost and forests, the political prisoners in cold cells, the families split apart by a knock at the door. Khrushchev's words, however insufficient, marked the beginning of an era where silence could no longer be absolute. The story of the Gulag does not end with the closing of its camps or the fall of the Soviet Union. Its legacy lingers in the silence of forests where forgotten graves lie hidden, in the faded memories of those who survived, and in the reluctance of institutions to fully reckon with a past so devastating. The trauma of the Gulag did not simply vanish when the gates opened. It etched itself into the very soul of a society, into the families torn apart, into the fear passed from one generation to the next, into the caution in people's eyes when speaking of power, of authority, of justice. For those who endured the system, life after release was not always freedom. Many returned to cities that no longer remembered them, to families who had moved on or disappeared. They carried labels that marked them as dangerous or undesirable. Their resumes bore the invisible ink of imprisonment. Their souls bore the visible scars of survival. Some tried to speak. Others remained silent, perhaps fearing they would not be believed. Or perhaps because some wounds resist even words. Entire regions had been shaped by the Gulag places, where towns sprung up only to serve the camps, where roads were paved by prisoners' hands, and where infrastructure still stands atop the suffering of countless thousands. These places today might seem ordinary, but their soil remembers. And so do the people, though memory is fragile, and time has a way of dulling even the sharpest truths. When Khrushchev acknowledged the horrors of Stalin's reign in his 1956 secret speech, it opened a crack in the monolith of silence. Some were released. Some were rehabilitated on paper. But paperwork could not restore lost years, reunite shattered families, or bring back the dead. The full story remained buried beneath official records, propaganda, and denial. Generations grew up with only fragments of truth whispers behind closed doors, a photograph hidden in a drawer, a missing grandfather whose name could not be spoken. Even today, debate continues in Russia over how the Gulag should be remembered. Some see it as a necessary sacrifice for rapid industrialization. Others view it as a brutal stain on the nation's conscience. Memorials have been built, museums opened, and archives slowly unsealed, yet efforts at remembrance are often met with resistance. The tension between pride in past achievements and sorrow over past atrocities creates a national dissonance, unresolved and raw. This legacy is not just historical, it is psychological. The habits born in that era still echo: the self-censorship, the mistrust of institutions, the quiet acceptance of injustice as part of life. In some ways, the shadow of the Gulag still moves silently across Russian society. A nation cannot move forward unless it understands where it has been. Healing requires honesty, and yet honesty often feels too dangerous, even now. But the stories survive. In memoirs smuggled out of the camps, in poetry scratched into wooden walls, in grandchildren who ask the questions their parents were too afraid to voice, in historians who dig deeper, in films, books, and conversations like the one we have shared today. Every act of remembrance is an act of resistance against forgetting, against erasure, against the idea that suffering in silence is ever acceptable. So, as we bring this journey to a close, let us not see the Gulag merely as a system of imprisonment, but as a mirror held up to the human condition. It showed how fear can become policy, how cruelty can be normalized, and how hope, even in its smallest flickers, can survive the darkest nights. It challenged the boundaries of endurance, and yet it could not extinguish the will to live, to resist, to remember. To everyone who has watched this video, thank you for walking through this difficult history with us. By choosing to learn, to reflect, and to empathize, you honor the memory of those who lived and died within that system. If you found this story meaningful, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with others. Your support allows us to continue exploring stories that matter, stories that are often hidden, uncomfortable, but necessary. And now, wherever you are in the world, whether you are reflecting on history or just winding down after a long day, I wish you peace, rest, and a good night. May we never forget the lessons of the past. Sleep well, and we will see you in the next story.